In this clip we complete the discussion of the 10 best stories from the life of St Francis of Assisi. You may prefer to watch clip number 5.1 first. The purpose of this clip is to assist with preparation for the Spiritist Meditation event being held on the Feast of St Francis at the Cottesloe Civic Centre in Perth, Australia on Sunday the 4th of October 2015. "Shame on you, you've insulted Lady Poverty," said Francis. It was for the first and last time that he spoke angrily to his brothers. What flared up in him was the anger of Jesus, who cast out all of them who bought and sold in the temple, and who overthrew the tables of the money changers. Francis resigned from his post in the administration of the order. His place was initially taken by Brother Pietro, but when he died shortly thereafter, the Church requested responsibility be given to another, the Franciscan Judas, Brother Elias. Brother Elias introduced a clear administrative organisation while Francis was abroad. On returning in 1220, Francis found that Elias had introduced discipline and learning and established monasteries with libraries and beautiful churches. Elias loved Francis, and he acted to prove the world that Francis was a saint and to assure the brotherhood everywhere of the respect it deserved. He sought to build up the power and fame of the order and to make it one of the pillars of the Church. According to one of Francis's biographers, René Philip Miller, the strict organisation triumphed over the informal gathering under Elias. Rational deduction killed song and melody, and cheerfulness fell victim to austerity. The ideal of the saint was vanquished by the practical needs of the world. Elias held important positions in the order before and after the death of Francis. He was divisive, but he also left us with the legacy of a beautiful Basilica of St Francis, one of the marvels of architecture, but exactly what the saint would not have wanted. Francis felt a deep union with the creatures who relied completely on God. One writer says, "St Francis loved the ants less than any other animal, because of the great care they take in summer to gather and lay up a store of grain against the winter. But he said that he loved the birds far better, because they gathered nothing one day for another." Thomas of Solano, the first biographer of St Francis, tells us of the rabbit and the pheasant who could not bear to be separated from the saint, of the friendly falcon who awakened Francis at night for prayer but did not do so when he was sick, of the cricket who would rest in Francis's hand and sing at his request. But arguably the most famous of the stories of Francis and the animals involve the wolf of Gubbio and talking to the birds. Here's how these incidents are described. Francis was living in Gubbio when a wolf was attacking and eating livestock and humans. No one was able to kill the wolf, and the citizens were afraid to leave the city. Francis sought to address the issue directly with the wolf, but the animal rushed at him with its jaws open. Francis made the sign of the cross and commanded the wolf to cease its attacks in the name of God, at which point the wolf trotted up to him docilely and lay it at his feet, putting his head in his hands. Francis proposed that the citizens would feed the wolf if it agreed not to attack them. In the agreement, the wolf put its paws in Francis's hand. When the wolf accompanied Francis into the city like a docile pet, the citizens considered it a miracle. Entering into a field one day, Francis began to preach to the birds which were on the ground, and suddenly all of those on the trees came round him, and all listened. They did not fly away until he'd given them his blessing. All the birds opened their beaks, stretched their necks, stretched their wings, and reverently bowed their heads to the ground, endeavouring by their motions and by their songs to manifest their joy to him. Piandayaca between Bavanga and Canara claims to be the site of this incident, but there's also a plaque on Mount Subiazo in the hills beyond Assisi claiming that St Francis preached to the birds in the tree there. Alviano was the first little town whose inhabitants requested to be jointly admitted to the Brotherhood of St Francis. This led to the creation of the Third Order, whose members, married people, were to stay in the world but not be of it. The conversion in Alviano was the result of the preaching by Francis in the marketplace of that town. Undoubtedly this touched them deeply, but there was a miracle that preceded the sermon. It was toward nightfall, and hundreds of swallows, whose nests were hidden everywhere in Alviano, kept circling around the square, which resounded with the unceasing twitter. Francis sang and the crowd waited for the sermon to begin, but the swallows kept coming in ever greater numbers, circling closer and closer and making more and more noise. Francis waited a while. Finally, he turned to them and said in a soft voice, "My brothers and sisters, the swallow, it's now time for me to speak. You have been speaking enough all of the time." And right away the swallows were silent. Only when Francis had finished and the closing hymn was sung did the swallows again twitter. People considered this a miracle. Francis transformed medieval thinking by his recognition of nature, and churches around the world now celebrate World Animal Day on the first Sunday of October, and this year that coincides with the feast of St Francis. The most famous church is the Church of St John the Divine in New York City, which has celebrated the beauty of the animal kingdom in a silent procession of all creatures great and small on World Animal Day since 1984. The tradition is that Francis's birth linked him to Jesus. And I quote, "Pica was overdue in delivering her first child, Francis, and many of her friends were concerned that something was wrong. One day a stranger came to her house and told Pica that she would not be able to give birth unless she moved into a stable, like Mary, the mother of Jesus. She immediately went to the small barn that was adjacent to the family house and there gave birth to her son. The same stranger who had knocked at her door also appeared at Francis's baptism and asked her to hold the baby at the font. Afterward he knelt on the step of the altar and a miraculous imprint of his knee appeared in the stone, after which he disappeared. Pica claimed that he was an angel. She called her young son Giovanni, after St. John the Baptist." In 1223, Francis had just come from Rome to Greccio. Francis understood the humility of the incarnation of Jesus, and he wanted to emphasize this aspect in an homage to celebrate the birth. Francis put a baby in a manger with an ox and a donkey watching in a cave in the hills above the town. There is debate about whether the baby was real or not, most likely not, as one bystander claims it came to life. But this was said to be the first nativity scene. After Francis's death, the tradition of the crib became quite widespread. The Crucifix bookends the mystic life of St Francis of Assisi. In this part of the clip we'll discuss the Crucifix of San Gimignano, the Tau, and St Francis receiving the crucifixion wounds of Jesus. St Francis was praying for enlightenment on his vocation before the crucifix in the derelict church of San Gimignano at the foothills of Assisi. He hears the voice of Jesus, "Go, Francis, and repair my house. As you can see, it's falling into ruin." From that time, Francis could no longer hold back the tears and cried aloud about the passion of Jesus, which was always before his eyes. Francis took the words literally. As the son of a merchant, he first tried to get the funds for the repairs, and then he begged for stones and mortar, and then he actually repaired the building. After finishing San Gimignano, he restored the church of San Pietro, and he then went on to restore the chapel of St Mary of the Angels, the primitive country church that was to become the headquarters of the order. Francis ultimately realised that it was the clerical corruption of the Catholic Church that had to be fixed. By the end of his life, 15,000 friars minor were rebuilding the Catholic Church by proclaiming the gospel in a new way. The icon before which Francis had this mystical experience, where he heard the voice of Jesus, is now in the Basilica of St Clare in Assisi. The prayer that Francis made before the icon is on the screen now. This is the church of San Gimignano today. The white line marks the boundary of the original church that was rebuilt by Francis. When his work at San Gimignano was finished, he'd set up an entirely new form of pointed arch, which later historians of architecture have maintained presaged the coming of the new style of the early Renaissance, according to René Philip Miller. San Gimignano housed the Poor Clares, the female order of Franciscans, until 1260. 7 years after the death of Clare. It's now home to Franciscan friars and those determining their vocation. We're going to end this presentation with a discussion of the Stigmata, the wounds of Jesus. Francis was alone at the top of Mount Alverna, having just begun a 40-day fast in honour of the Archangel Michael. While deep in contemplation, an angel with 6 bright wings, gleaming like fire, appeared to him. The angel was suspended on a cross, or had the marks of the crucifixion. Francis received the Stigmata, the wounds of Jesus, in his hands, his feet, and in his side, and this is the first recorded instance of this mystical experience. Within a few days, Francis composed a prayer, the praise of the God Most High, which we'll look at on the next slide. One of Francis's biographers, Saint Bonaventure, describes Francis's experience during the stigmatization. When the vision vanished after a mysterious and intimate conversation, it left Francis aglow with sephiric love in his soul. Externally, however, it left marks on his body like those of the crucified, as if the impression of a seal had been left on a heated wag. The figures of the nails appeared immediately on his hands and feet. The heads of the nails were inside his hands, but on top of his feet, with their points extending through to the opposite side. His right side, too, showed a blood-red wound, as if it had been pierced by a lance. The blood flowed frequently from it. Please stop the video and read this prayer, which was composed by Francis after receiving the Stigmata in 1224. He dictated the prayer to Brother Leo. The manuscript for this prayer is held in Assisi, and on the back of it is a message for Brother Leo in Francis's own stigmatized hand. It's one of only 2 documents with Francis's handwriting. After you've studied the prayer on the slide, then please continue with the presentation. In the blessing of Brother Leo, Francis wrote on parchment, "May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord show you his face to you and be merciful to you. May the Lord lift you up his countenance upon you and give you peace. God bless you, Brother Leo." Francis then sketched a head of Brother Leo and drew a tau, a T-shaped cross, over his portrait. St Francis was present at the Fourth Lateran Council, and he heard the words of Pope Innocent III when he said, "The tau has exactly the same form as the cross on which our Lord was crucified on Calvary, and only those will be marked with this sign and will obtain mercy who've mortified their flesh and conformed their life to that of the crucified Saviour." The tau is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it was used symbolically in the Old Testament. The tau is the sign placed upon the foreheads of the poor of Israel. It saves them from extermination. Francis used the tau in his writings. He painted it on walls and doors of the places where he stayed, and he used it as his only signature on his writings. Francis's tunic, which you can see in the photograph, was in the shape of a tau. He said the brown of the tunic resembled the colour of the swallows, and he also said that the coarseness of the robe was to mirror that of St John the Baptist, which Jesus praised. This is the second part of the 5th clip in a series of clips aimed at providing some background about St Francis of Assisi ahead of our meditation day at the Cottesloe Civic Centre in Perth on Sunday the 4th of October. Just reminding you that it's essential that you register online if you wish to attend this special meditation event.